So, the international tax practice surveys tax directors all around the world on a regular basis to hear what's top of mind. And in Europe, what we found was that heads of tax are prioritizing office return considerations, weighing the benefits of remote work against the challenges that are created in terms of tax exposures and liabilities, and just managing the team. Of course, there are also significant concerns about permanent establishment, but I'm just very interested. A survey of European heads of tax said this is a priority. Thalia, maybe I could turn it over to you first and ask, what are you hearing from clients in the Irish perspective?
Thanks, Rodney. From talking to our clients, the number of employees looking to work remotely across borders on a regular basis has substantially increased. And there can be clear benefits to employers from providing such flexibility. For example, access to a more talent pool, being viewed as an employer of choice when looking to attract and retain key talent. However, determining that level of flexibility to adopt needs careful consideration due to the potential impact on company compliance and costs. The typical cross-border remote working requests we're seeing in practice fall into three broad categories. Employees looking to extend a period of vacation overseas by working either side of holidays. Employees looking to work remotely for an extended period annually, perhaps 3 to 4 months a year. And employees who wish to base themselves overseas for personal reasons and work either fully or partly from that location indefinitely. Clients are really looking to understand the potential corporate tax, employer obligations, and personal tax impact of such proposed arrangements. They're also looking for support from us in developing a policy on remote working, as well as help with the ongoing process of reviewing and managing remote working requests. Now, employer payroll obligations, both at home and in the overseas location, are often determined by the personal tax residency position of the employee, as well as where duties are performed in a tax year. And we're finding that overseas employer payroll obligations are often intertwined with the existence of a PE or other corporate presence of the home employer overseas, so that the corporate tax analysis will often be a deciding factor when assessing the level of flexibility that can be afforded to employees. And lastly, Social Security is often a hidden cost that needs assessment by the employer too. In general, contributions should be paid where employment is exercised, but there are some exceptions to this. And the employee and the employer may find that the rate of contributions increase, or worse, that contributions are payable in both locations. So managing the working arrangement is important from a cost perspective and to ensure entitlement to social benefits for the employee.
And Anna, talk to us a little about what you're thinking about in the corporate tax space.
Yes, Rodney, Thalia mentioned corporate tax there, and she called out PEs. The importance of the corporate tax analysis here really can't be understated, because if you are now going to have people located overseas where you mightn't have had them before, or indeed you're going to change the balance of employees that you're going to have abroad, that is going to potentially materially impact on the group's tax liabilities. So maybe you create a permanent establishment or an additional corporate tax presence in country, or maybe you change, I suppose, the nature of the transfer pricing arrangements that need to be put in place. And, Thalia referred to 3 different types of scenarios that we're seeing. I mean, it's important for any company to assess not just the short-term remote working arrangements, and we've seen plenty of them in the recent past, but also arrangements where employees are now asking for flexibility to work indefinitely in a different location to where their home office might be. I mean, some of the areas that we need to focus on from a corporate tax perspective, really to look at the PE and the transfer pricing issues, cause us to look at probably the seniority of the employee, their job. So what are they going to do in the other location? Are they somebody who generates revenue, or maybe are they more of a service provider to the organization? And so it's critically important, and we've seen this with our clients, that we need to establish, the employers need to establish clear guardrails for who can, and perhaps more importantly, who cannot work overseas or work away from the home office on a long-term basis.
So that's a lot to think about. How are we helping clients then?
So, I mean, it can be pretty daunting for employers to understand broad compliance risks and consider both the business and employee preferences around remote working and develop a policy that's really fit for purpose in this area. And, while HR and global mobility teams internally are often tasked with people issues, given the breadth of the compliance considerations arising, really all stakeholders need to be involved in those discussions. So your tax, your legal, the business leaders, each of those will have different priorities, which will shape the final approach a business needs to take. And where we're really supporting our clients is where we adopt a structured approach to break down some of those work streams into manageable phases. So the first phase, for example, might be the discovery phase, where we help stakeholders review what's happened to date and run some data analytics around some potential historical compliance risks. And we might find there's some remedial actions that may need to be taken as a result of that. And then we move on to, I suppose, a more defining phase where we help stakeholders identify what are the business and the employee's needs, what would an ideal remote working model look like, and what's your risk profile. And from that, we can help define the roles and responsibilities internally within the business and develop some of the implementation concepts that are needed. And then we move on to, I suppose, a more structured design phase. And that helps to establish many of the concepts that Anna referred to there, who's eligible to work overseas, who's prohibited, maybe due to regulatory or tax reasons. What rules will we apply to eligible employees? What supports will we as a business provide to the employees, if any, that are working remotely? And then all of that effectively is distilled into a policy framework and process map. And that will provide a key framework for the business to move forward. We usually also prepare a communication to employees to set out their personal obligations in an overseas location. And that also helps to clarify the extent of any employer supports around tax payments or tax return preparation support. And that's really important for both the company and the employee so that expectations are managed from the outset and there's no surprises down the road. And once all of that is achieved, Rodney, we then move on to the last phase, which is really deployment. And a key component here would be, communicating the policies and processes to the business, implementing the approval request process, and then ongoing monitoring of the compliance requirements.
So really interesting, Thalia. I mean, a very structured 4-phase approach: discovery, define, design, and deploy, aimed at sort of chunking this down into manageable segments to make sure all stakeholders are moving forward at the same speed. Anna, I'm just curious, how have we seen this approach work in practice?
Yeah, the approach that Thalia outlined there, Rodney, has actually worked very well in practice. Because employers can be really at very different stages of their working from anywhere journey. And so the process that Thalia outlined there seems to work very well and helps the employer to think through all of the various different stages and phases that are going to be involved. I mean, Thalia and myself have recently worked together with a very large multinational to help them to formulate their remote working policy and to help them understand and manage the compliance risks associated with that. So in that case, we had to do a corporate tax analysis. That was obviously critical, imperative to find out what the activities of the employees overseas were going to be and to make sure that they didn't create any additional PE or corporate tax risk. We also helped them define which roles could be supported and which ones could be done anywhere, if you like, or which ones needed to be done where the home office was located. We were then able to provide specific country-by-country rules, which would act as guardrails for the employees who may be eligible for either short-term working or a longer-term framework. So that enabled our client to put a clear framework in place and helped the business ultimately to manage the myriad of requests that they got and will continue to get from employees. And I suppose one of the key learnings in all of that, and I think Thalia mentioned it earlier, was it's not just the payroll tax team. It's not just the corporate tax team. It's not just the global mobility team. There's a real HR component to all of this. You're managing employees, and yet you're trying to balance that with managing the needs of the business. So really important that all of the teams are working together and appreciate the sensitivities and complications that arise.
And that's really interesting, Anna, because of course we're all tax people, so we tend to think of tax as the most important thing, of course. But there are all those human dimensions that are so much more important. And so, Thalia and Anna, as you talk to Irish stakeholders on this, do you have a couple of practical considerations that people sometimes overlook that are nonetheless really important?
Well, I suppose focusing more on the HR people side of things, a key headline for me would be to not forget the makeup and the impact of the makeup of the reward package on the overall compliance and tax analysis. So we've talked a little bit about some of the payroll compliance risks, but it's worth remembering that there may well be differences in how a home-based reward package is treated, especially where it includes equity awards or pension contributions. And that may have a very different tax analysis in the overseas location than would otherwise be expected. And where those liabilities arise overseas in employment income, that different tax treatment can impact the net income of the employee. For example, there may well be mandatory benefits that need to be provided in the overseas location, or perhaps employer contributions to the home-based pension scheme is effectively considered additional taxable income overseas if maintained. So as a result, we would generally recommend a review of both the pay and benefit schemes that will be provided to individuals who will work overseas as part of the overall compliance management approach. And this may mean that changes to the employing entity and appropriate terms and conditions may need to be considered to support the new working arrangement.
Interesting. And Anna, what about from your perspective?
Yeah, from the corporate tax perspective, in order to manage the PE risk, we have, I suppose, seen a number of companies look at whether they should transfer employees to other group entities or whether they should establish a global employment company, which might be the company that would be registered to deal with various different tax, pay and benefit obligations in countries. So we are seeing, I suppose, interest in alternative employment structures that we mightn't have seen so often before. So I think it is important to look at the different types of arrangements that might be available that would help a company to manage any PE risk that might arise as a consequence of a more flexible approach to working.
So interesting. So just a lot to chew on as you are talking to folk in Ireland. I'm just curious, Ruben and Aroen, how that compares or contrasts with discussions you have when you're working with clients in the Netherlands. Ruben, maybe I could turn to you next.
Yes, Rodney, thank you. Based on conversations with companies in the Netherlands and other European countries as well about this topic, it's clear that for many employers, the entire remote working development seem to be a bit overwhelming in terms of how to tackle it and more specifically where to start. So firstly, I fully agree with Thalia that having a structured approach seems to be critical. And in that regard, I would like to emphasize that as part of the initial investigation and the design phase, it's important to clearly define what type of remote working the company is actually talking about. Because there are many different types of remote working, such as domestic versus international, working, let's say, remotely in a fixed term or on the basis of a permanent approach, fully remote, or some kind of a hybrid version, working from home and in the office. And in addition, these different variances can be combined to make it even more complex. So as you can imagine, the potential compliance risks in corporate tax, in income, wage tax, employment law are really dependent on the exact type of remote working. So in order to prevent misunderstanding at the final stages of that process that Thalia was just talking about, I would really recommend to start clearly describing what type of remote working the employer is looking at and to use these consistently for further risk assessments and design of a new framework.
Hmm. And Aroen, what additional considerations are you hearing from clients on the corporate tax side?
I think Anna had a lot of good points there, but one thing I would like to add is a lot of countries like the Netherlands embrace the updated guidance that was issued by the OECD Secretariat on tax treaties and the impact of COVID-19. And that was the updated guidance of the one that was issued in April 2020. And the treaty guidance concerns like topics: when does a home office create a PE if an employee has to work from home due to public health measures? But also it covers like dependent agency PEs if the work is done from home purely because of those measures. And in short, if there was no PE before the start of the pandemic, the extraordinary nature of the pandemic combined with those public health measures does not on its own create a PE during the pandemic. So if we look, what are we doing for clients? We are helping clients with those specific guidance in each country and how it really impacts them. And also we are assisting them going forward with their remote working policy to manage the PE risk and the compliance risk in the future.
So that's really interesting, Aroen, because that's a very factually intense country by country, sort of shows the
analysis, right?
Yeah, shows the need for a globally coordinated team. So I'm interested, Ruben and Aroen, just like I put Anna and Thalia on the spot about practical considerations. As you're talking to clients in the Netherlands and elsewhere, what are a couple of the key practical considerations you keep coming up against?
Yes, I have a very practical one for a very specific group of remote workers, you can say, which is actually part of almost every conversation we have these days around the topic, which are actually the European cross-border commuters. As you know, in Europe, we have a lot of commuters. And since the start of the corona pandemic, a lot of these countries have issued some temporary bilateral concessions or arrangements to reduce actually or mitigate the potential negative consequences in the personal income tax and the wage tax area for the employer to, let's say, for cross-border workers, as a result of the fact that they were unable to, let's say, apply their regular working pattern, living in one country, working in the other one, commuting every day, but had to work from home. And in short, based on these arrangements, employers and their cross-border commuting personnel were allowed to apply the same allocation of levy rights on employment income as they did before the pandemic. And the actual status of these arrangements is that specifically for the combinations Netherlands, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, and some other countries as well, authorities have announced that these temporary concessions will stop by the end of this year. So as a result, I recommend employers to, first of all, check what the status of these temporary arrangements is, and secondly, to clearly start communicating to their employees about the anticipated end dates of these concessions. And finally, perhaps to determine what their approach is for the period starting January 2022. Will they continue to allow these specific group of employees to work from home if they are not, if it's not mandated still? And if so, the tax and social security implications should again be assessed in both countries. And since we're only a couple of months from year end, I think it's important to undertake these actions, the sooner the better.
Well, Ruben, that's really good advice, because I think we've all grown a little complacent about living in COVID times, right? And so the thought that these concessions might stop in just a couple of months' time really is a wake-up call for those that aren't focusing on it, just given how complicated this area is.
Indeed.
What about from your perspective, Aroen?
Yeah, so what I see happening now is that a lot of clients that issued a global remote working policy are now considering to tighten the policy again in the future post-pandemic. The policy is really meant to cover only that part of the workforce where they see the risk and the accompanying compliance burden is manageable and overseeable. And they realize now that in respect of more senior employees, the risk of a possible PE going forward and the compliance burden is so high that clients are restricting them to work from anywhere in the future. So it's sort of a retracting kind of movement that we see.
Really interesting, Aroen. So pace of change continues. So we certainly have covered a lot. So it's clear why this is top of mind to heads of tax in Europe. There's so much to consider. And really, if nothing else, I've taken from this just the broad array of stakeholders you need to bring to the table to be effective, the need for some sort of structured approach so everything is addressed, and then some of these practical points like the timeline around the concessions changing and maybe people reconsidering their remote working policies clearly shows that this is a huge area of focus, and just because it deals with people, just so critical to get right. So Anna, Thalia, Aroen and Ruben, thank you very much for your time today. This has been a fascinating discussion.